Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, and this is Pints with Aquinas. In this episode, I thought that we could talk about the morality of smoking, or like the morality of tobacco consumption. I don't want to talk about cigarettes, although I'd be happy to at another time, nor do I want to talk about marijuana, although I have talked about that with Matt previously. It's got to be like 3 years ago, although it feels like 3 billion years ago. I want to talk about cigars and pipes. Why? Well, it seems like the most benign form of tobacco consumption, so it seems like a good place to start. But it's also something that like a lot of Catholics are very passionate about, whether vehemently arguing for it or vehemently arguing against it. So it's something that's, the conversation is already underway. So this is just a modest contribution. I thought I could supply some principles and some arguments to maybe orient the discourse. I'm going to give a modest defense of cigar and pipe smoking. Pipe smoking. Ooh, speak, Father Gregory. Here we go. Okay. It seems like the conversation often starts with a consideration of the health effects, which is, a good enough place to start, I suppose. So tobacco, it seems to me, or at least studies have shown, has carcinogens, and carcinogens cause cancer. So there is a concern that consuming pipes and tobacco, consuming tobacco in the form of pipes or cigars could have a cancer-causing effect. So good thing to be sensitive to. With respect to that, I would say that you have a lot of studies done on cigarette consumption. And when it comes to cigarette consumption, far more carcinogenic. And in part, that's because of how the tobacco is processed and the chemicals which are added to it. In the case of most cigars and pipe tobacco, the tobacco is treated minimally, right? So far fewer chemicals are added. Like a cigar, it pretends to be, or pretends in the French sense. Gosh, man, it claims to be, Father Gregory, you're losing it. It claims to be just 3 tobacco leaves, okay? Some people will make the argument, which I think is spurious. It's just something that God gave us, so what's the wrong in smoking it? Not all natural products are to be consumed willy-nilly. CF, marijuana argument. I don't think that you can make that argument because I just think it's somewhat irresponsible. That's an initial thought there. But there have been a lot of studies done on the negative effects of cigarette smoking when it comes to like lung cancer or COPD or other various maladies. There have been very, very few studies done on cigar or pipe smoking. Mind you, that's because there's no big lobby on Capitol Hill which is trying to inveigh against the consumption of cigars or of pipes in the way in which there is against the consumption of cigarettes. So part of it is just follow the money. But it seems like beyond anecdotal evidence, we would have some further evidence which would contribute to the conversation. At this point, there's just a dearth of evidence, okay? So that's something to be sensitive to, something to be aware of. I'm not saying it proves for or against. It's, if anything, it's an argument from silence. Not total silence, but relative silence. Also, there is one key difference between cigarette smoking and cigar and pipe smoking, that you inhale cigarettes. Now, people who have smoked cigarettes, typically when they smoke cigars or pipes, they tend to inhale those too. But you're not supposed to, okay? So it's not being exposed to your lungs, ideally. Now, it is being exposed to your lips, right? To your mouth, to your tongue, to your throat, all of which, can suffer the effects of carcinogenic bombardment. So I'm not saying, go for it, it's good for your health. I'm just saying it's different. It's at least slightly different. But there are further health, considerations to be taken account of. Like people, when they smoke cigars for the first time, often feel sick, may even vomit. Okay, so in what sense is this buzz, which hit so hard, a thing to be cultivated? All right, so I would say that that's true of one's first go at many different consumables. So I don't know that obtains. The other thing is like my experience, smoking a cigar does affect my sleep. So that's not inconsequential. That's not insignificant. Because I think that health isn't just a matter of like whether or not I get cancer. Health is just trying to cultivate balance so that way you can be about your duties and responsibilities in life in accord with your state to the glory of God and the salvation of souls. So I used to smoke cigars more. I smoke them less and only infrequently, and that's a big part of why. Because I want to be alert in the morning for prayer, if God gives me leave to sleep, and I just want to be present to my tasks and duties without being, kind of ground under by the sorrow and anger which comes with fatigue. So, health considerations. But I think it's good to frame these health considerations within a kind of broader understanding that your life is not for the optimization or maximization of your bodily health. That's not to say that you shouldn't consider it, but it's a subordinate or it's a lower consideration that needs to be incorporated within a superordinate or higher consideration, which is your spiritual health. Okay? So your bodily health is part of that story, but your spiritual health ultimately has pride of place. So if you're going to incorporate things which may have negative effects bodily, I think one way in which to justify them or to argue for them is because they promote other spiritual goods or they help you attain to other spiritual ends. So again, I said this is a modest argument, modest argument. So I'm just trying to be honest and laying things out without scandalizing, which brings us to our next point. Okay, so cigars, especially, like pipes are usually seen as pedantic, kind of academic-y type things, and people dismiss them as so much tomfoolery, so they tend not to be thrown for a loop when they see you smoking a pipe. If anything, they're fascinated. I think aesthetically, there's greater resistance towards cigar smoking, and perhaps it's appropriate. At least in the United States, cigars are seen as a luxury product, insofar as the general cultural perception is that they are expensive. And there are some cigars which are expensive, but I would also say that there are other cigars which are less expensive. But that's not the whole story, because perceived luxury is its own kind of moral consideration. So if somebody sees something and is scandalized by it, we're in a certain sense responsible for their reception. You can think about like the weaker brethren principle as St. Paul enunciates it. So we are responsible for how others, I think, receive what we do, not insofar as we're like insecurely and kind of like frantically trying to shape their reception so that way we're maximally liked by all persons and minimally detested. That's just like, bleh, who cares? There are going to be things for which you are hated, but I think it's important to be hated for those things which are essential, okay? I think it's good to be hated if it's for love of our Lord Jesus Christ and for the announcement of his gospel. You can think about the last beatitude, blessed are you when you are persecuted for my sake. So I don't think that means that we get rid of any action or activity that can be potentially misconstrued by our contemporaries, because that would probably prove paralyzing insofar as the world is so polarized that half of the world is almost bound to be scandalized by whatever it is that you're doing, just as much as the other half of the world is going to celebrate it. But I don't think that, it's not just a matter of tribalism, it's not just a matter of camp mentality, it's a matter of trying to be somewhat sensitive to the sensitivities of others. So that way you don't unnecessarily or accidentally throw them for a loop. So I think that we're responsible for that. But I think you can address that by context, okay? So I don't think it's like, if you think that this could be upsetting for people, maybe you don't smoke a cigar or a pipe on top of a mountaintop while live streaming it and announcing it before all the world. But, can you do it in the context of a more intimate setting? Potentially, okay? So I think it's up for, it's kind of up to you to shape the reception of that activity. So like among my friends, there are some people who are willing to push more and some people who are not willing to push more, or they'd be reticent to push. And then there's some who push against. They say it really shouldn't be done. It could be potentially scandalous. A lot of people have negative associations. Therefore, we corporately in this setting at this, retreat or whatever, shouldn't do it. So that's all part of the consideration. Okay, so at this point we've talked about health, like health effects, where health considerations fall within our overall, flourishing as a human person. And then when it comes to furthermore shaping the reception of other people and whether this perceived luxury product or perceived like whatever could be upsetting, that's also part of the moral calculus. But when it comes to, so that's me addressing certain problems or certain arguments against. But here I think is like one of the substantive reasons for which I like smoking cigars. And you feel free to disagree with me and to think these arguments paper thin or otherwise flimsy. So I think that it's good to find things around which you can congregate. And in a grander sense, I think that friendship is just a kind of congregating around or in the good. C.S. Lewis has this image of friends who are side by side in pursuit of a common goal, and it's that common goal which really draws them together. He repeats that in order to have friends, you need to love something more than friends. So you can't just come to your friend and say, like, I want a friend. You have to be able to say, I'm interested in this thing, or I'm animated by this thing. Would you like to pursue this thing with me? Not in so many words, but you get the point. And I think that there's just a real good to the human communion which grows up around conversations, exchanges, debates, whatever it is. And I think that you have to find a way in which to frame that. And I think that in the 21st century, we're gradually losing the capacity to do that, which is unfortunate because it used to be more normal or standard to congregate around simple human goods and that become a launching off point or a jumping off point for further, more substantive conversations. But I think that's becoming harder and harder as everyone is, looking at their phone or abstracted by their own personal considerations. The communal dimension is harder to achieve. In my experience, I think that alcohol and tobacco facilitate these types of exchanges, and I'm thinking especially among men. So my experience is that women tend to consume cigars and pipes less, and I don't think that this necessarily makes it a kind of like bravado, chest-thumping exercise of the patriarchy. I think it's just a kind of tacit recognition of the fact that men tend to open up and they tend to exchange less readily because they're less, if this is falling into crass gender stereotypes, you just please forgive me, because they're more reticent to share or they're less willing to kind of connect on a more emotional or psychological level or even spiritual level. Okay. So I think in that you need to find ways in which to frame the conversation, to invite people to come forth and to share what it is that they think or what it is that they choose. So that way you can build up a common life on the basis of that exchange. My experience is that alcohol and tobacco are very good at doing that. And I'm not saying bender after bender. I'm just saying, moderate use, moderate consumption of alcohol and tobacco. And there are physical reasons for which it kind of has a dilating effect. And it helps you to kind of like drop certain inhibitions. And I think that's fine. And I think that we see that culturally enshrined or kind of culturally commemorated in art and in literature. I was thinking about The Lord of the Rings recently. It's kind of no surprise. Well, maybe it is a surprise, but it's no mistake that The Lord of the Rings begins and ends with smoking, like smoking the peace pipe. And that's not because the whole thing was a hallucination or just like a kind of crazed fever dream. It's because it was an entry into a reality which needs to be recounted, and it's recounted in this folkloric way as a kind of nostalgic recovering of what once was. It attains to a kind of mythic proportion, and there's a sense in which the consumption of tobacco frames that, and it frames it nicely. Yeah, I mean, you could say further things about marijuana and how it's different. You could say further things about cigarettes and how they're different. But that, for me, is probably the heart of the matter, okay? So it's a calculated risk with potential negative health effects taken in the setting of the attaining to or the pursuing of a higher spiritual good, all the while trying to shape the reception of that activity so it doesn't scandalize, throw people for a loop, whilst not trying to advance it as something that everyone must do, but making a modest proposal that it's something that some people might do, and perhaps in doing so, not incur the judgment or scorn of those who would prefer they do otherwise. So, yeah, that's my effort at something small, at something simple. Boom. Okay, that's what I wanted to share. This is Pints with Aquinas. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe to the channel, push the bell, and get email updates when other things come out. Also, if you haven't yet, please do check out Godsplaining, which is a podcast of the Dominican friars in my province. I contribute to it with 4 other of my confreres, so great fun. Lots of sweet exchanges about random stuff, but basically all things Catholic. And then last but not least, I wrote a book. It's called Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly, and the type of moral considerations which factor into daily life and help us to shape our discernment, like you've just heard with the consumption of tobacco products, is the bread and butter of that book. So if you find that stuff helpful, then you might want to inquire further. Okay, know of my prayers for you. Please pray for me, and I will look forward to chatting with you next time on Pints with Aquinas.